la reunión prevista para el día de hoy. Les habla Jorge Gil, presidente del GLENIF o GLAS por sus siglas en inglés. Como han sido invitados y ustedes conocen el tema, que es presentación por parte del IASB de todo este pedido de información sobre la reforma de la NIS-PYME. No vamos a hablar demasiado del tema, pues están los expositores que tratarán este tema en detalle. Desde luego, entonces, que agradecemos la presencia de Tadeu Sendón, miembro del IASB, que nos ha permitido este acercamiento para poder conocer directamente desde quienes están trabajando en recibir la información que vamos a remitir todos los países del mundo, poder conocer en detalle lo que ellos han pensado en relación con la reforma de la NIS para pymes. De parte de nuestro directorio, muchas gracias a todos los asistentes, nuestro directorio que está presente también, Felipe Pérez Cervantes de México, José Luis Carvalho de Brasil, Winston Fernández de Uruguay, Leonardo Barón García de Colombia, Dunia Zamora de Costa Rica, Noreli Pinto de Venezuela y Ángel Salazar de Perú, y quien les habla de Argentina. Muchísimas gracias por la presencia. Antes de darle la palabra a Tadeu, comentarles que la modalidad va a ser la presentación, primero por parte de Michelle y de Yusuf, de todo este bagaje de conocimientos que ellos tienen. Nosotros al final vamos a hacer las preguntas, dado que América Latina viene trabajando hace bastantes meses en tratar de armar la respuesta de toda América Latina, de toda la región, y ya estamos a un paso de tenerla. Han trabajado fuertemente el grupo de trabajo que fue armado para esto, y desde luego que ha sido difícil. Estamos ya terminando los últimos puntos de revisión por parte del directorio. También agradecer la presencia de los miembros del SMEs, alguno de ellos está conectado en estos momentos. Y como les dije, a medida que vayan avanzando en la presentación, si pueden ustedes hacer las preguntas vía chat, luego Tadeu va a seleccionar de esas preguntas, base al tiempo disponible, y las va a transmitir también en inglés para tanto Michelle como Yusuf poder responder adecuadamente nuestras inquietudes. Como somos muchos, alrededor, en este momento estamos ya 31 personas que están conectados. La modalidad va a ser a través del chat. Ojalá que tengamos una buena cantidad de preguntas para profundizar y poder de esta manera conocer las opiniones al respecto. Entonces, un agradecimiento especial, Tadeu, por toda esta gestión que has realizado. Michelle Samson, desde luego, siempre colaboradora con nosotros. Muchísimas gracias por todo. Y Yusuf Hansi también de la misma manera. Tadeu, te paso la palabra al respecto.
Gracias, Jorge. Más una vez, gracias por tener esta oportunidad de hablar un poco sobre nuestro proyecto. También para hacer la inclusión de Joseph, Michelle, yo voy a hablar ahora en inglés. Si quieres hacer la pregunta en el chat en inglés, está bien, porque es directo para nosotros hablamos. Si quieres hacer en español, también no hay problema. Yo puedo traducir para Michelle y Joseph para responder. Entonces, from now on, speaking in English, and then we can have Michelle and Joseph together with us. What George said, that he's just saying thank you for joining us. And the presentation will be first, you make the entire presentation. I think that's much better if you do it this way. And then after that, the people that are attending, including some members of the SMEs, will make some questions to you. And then, I don't know, Michelle, Joseph is going to start. Thank you very much.
So I'm going to start, but I've had a couple of connection problems. I'm just going to open presentation, and then I will hopefully be able to share the presentation on the screen with you. I apologise for this. I wasn't expecting to have the problems. So we've prepared quite a short presentation today, really to take you through the highlights of the request for information. At this stage of the request for information, we are very much hoping that we can have a good discussion with you, get an idea of your views on what the board is seeking information on. So I think hopefully you should now be able to see the presentation.
As we can see.
Good. Okay, so let me start by thanking you for inviting us along to discuss the request for information and for your time this afternoon or this morning. So I'm going to start with quite a short overview of the IFRS 4 SME standard, which I think you're all aware of. So as you know, it's a very short standard, only 250 pages long. It's tailored to meet the needs of small and medium-sized entities, which we describe as entities that do not have public accountability. So these are entities that are not listed on a stock exchange or don't hold assets in a fiduciary capacity. And we say it's based on the principles of full IFRS standards. And as we'll be discussing today, this will be one of the key areas that is in the request for information, because this based on the principles has really caused the board to stop and think as we entered into this second comprehensive review. And we'll explain how significant this second comprehensive review is, and how important that point about based on the principles of IFRS standards is. And as we say, it focuses on the information needs of lenders and other users of SME financial statements. So we'll also give you an overview of what we're trying to do at this stage to reach out to lenders and get a better understanding and to verify some of the facts the board has been using in the past about lenders. So the board takes this project very seriously. It has a dedicated team, which I now lead up. I used to work on stakeholder engagement with the national standard setters, but I've now moved from that role, and I'll be working with the team. But I have been working with the IFRS for SMEs since about 2010, and I was the person that led the project that implemented the IFRS for SMEs, or a similar standard in the UK. So on our website, we have a whole range of resources. There's a dedicated web page, which you can link into. We have the standard, various translations of the standard, and news items which we produce regularly. We have the materials that support the standard, so the updates, the questions that you can submit to the SME implementation group, and then a number of other resources. Importantly, the modules have a lot of material in them, and certainly during this COVID-19 time, I think the modules have got a lot of background material that can help with some of the challenges. There's a fact sheet that we recently updated about the SME standard. We write quarterly newsletters, so we published a newsletter recently where Daryl Scott, who was previously chair of the SME group and had been heavily involved in the SMEs, provided an overview. We also make available our presentations. So when we are presenting, we put those presentations on the website. And finally, the questions and answers that are submitted to the SMEs. So with that brief introduction, I'm going to give an introduction to this second comprehensive review, and I'll hand over to Yusuf, who will deal with the more technical parts of the review. So where are we? 2019 was when we started the comprehensive review, and I like to say it was a bit of a wobbly start, because I think the team had the expectation that we would go into the board would agree with the proposals we would be putting forward, and by August of 2019, request for information would be out. But that wasn't the case. We found that there were quite varying views from the board members, and actually it took us the best part of a year to agree what we should be even requesting information on. And I'll go through some of the challenges that we had in the early stages of the review. We have been very focused in trying to make responding to the RFI as easy as possible. So in addition to the request for information, we published an optional response document, which is a Word document, which just allows people to respond a bit more quickly to the document. But this time we've trialed an online survey. So on our website, you can pick up an online survey, and the questions are exactly the same as the questions that are in the request for information, but it's just a little bit simpler to complete. But on the other hand, we don't think we'll get the same quality of information. So when we get responses to that survey, we'll be looking at those a little bit more differently. Then more recently, we've published a very short survey, which is based on or focused on the needs of users. So in this survey, we only have
I think we lost you, Michelle.
We lost.
Yeah, we can see you, but we can't hear you. We are not still hearing you.
Put the message in the chat.
Yeah. Okay, but she's probably trying to reconnect. Yusuf, would you like to start from this moment on, or?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Michelle is back. Michelle, can you hear us?
No, we can see you. We can see the slides, but we can't hear you. I think she's not listening to us.
Hay que trabajar en la prevención y por supuesto que cuando el hecho ocurre hay que dar una respuesta, por eso hay que dar una respuesta y la respuesta tiene que ver con el poder penal, con el poder punitivo del Estado. Por eso también te marcaba
Daría, ¿podría cerrar los micrófonos de algún participante? Se escucha. Y no se escucha Michelle. Tadeo, no sé si podrá Yusuf continuar y a Michelle recomendarle que se desconecte y vuelva a conectarse.
Okay. Yusuf, do you have the presentation? Okay. Well, Michelle, it's what the suggestion is. Just if you just get out and in again, maybe it's going to work. Sorry about that, but it's for any reason we are not listening to you. We could see the slides, but not hear you. We can see you actually. We are not hearing you. Okay, yes, Yusuf. Now is you that is sharing that. Okay, fine. Michelle, if you can listen us, definitely the best would be you if you just log off and then log on again. Maybe it's going to work. And Yusuf, if you believe that you can take over from now on, just you are still mute. Yes, sir. Can you share the presentation? Yeah. We can see the presentation. Are you able to?
Yeah.
Okay. Fine.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So I'm going to take over in the meantime, and then we see if Michelle can reconnect. So this is the structure of the RFI. The RFI is structured in 3 parts. You have part A, part B, and part C. Part A talk about mostly the strategy. So let's have a look about part A. So when you look at part A, there are 2 approaches which are discussed in part A. One approach is a simplified IFRS standard approach, and this is how the IFRS for SMEs was developed. And the other approach is the independent approach. What the independent approach would mean that we would not look into full IFRS, but we will only look at only those issues which SMEs are facing, and we will fix them. So these are actually 2 extremes of a continuum. But if you look at it, there are a lot of places that we can actually land in between. Then the process of alignment, we are doing it in a very organized way. So we developed 3 alignment principles. The first alignment principle is relevance. What is relevance? Means we're going to look at whether the problem that the IFRS is addressing, is it relevant to SMEs? Once it passed the relevance test, we move on to see how we can simplify the requirements. And then the last alignment principle is faithful representation. So what it basically does is it looks at, after we have simplified the requirements, does it meet the faithful representation principles? Now, although cost and benefits is not specifically mentioned in the RFI, overall, we will look at the cost and benefits to SMEs. Now, if I move on to part B, so what you can see is in part A, it's very important that we understand whether you agree with alignment or whether you don't, and are you happy with the principles we've put in, and if we do follow the alignment principles, which date should we use? That is, what is the cutoff date we are going to use for those standards? Then part B goes into that alignment. Now that we know that we are going to follow the alignment, how would we do that? So part B is designed in a way that it assumes it uses the simplified IFRS standard approach. Now, because the board made limited changes to the IFRS for SMEs in the first comprehensive review, the second comprehensive review has a very wide scope. As you can see on the slide, there are many IFRS standards in the scope of this review. So IFRS 3, business combinations, IFRS 10, conflicted financial statements, IFRS 11, joint arrangements, IFRS 13, fair value measurement, and amendments to IAS 19, employee benefits, were all changes that were made quite a long time ago in full IFRS. They were considered in the first comprehensive review, but they were not incorporated. The reason for that is simply because the first comprehensive review, the board decided not to amend the IFRS for SMEs to minimize changes to what was then a newly issued standard, but also because many companies that had adopted the IFRS for SMEs had done so very recently. Therefore, we needed to reconsider them in this review to make sure that they are taken into account to reflect the board's thinking that alignment is important. The other thing to point out now is if we'll also look at the other standards, the new ones that have come in. So we got the conceptual framework that's been revised. Then we got the big ones, IFRS 9, 15, and 16. I'm going to talk about these in a little bit of more detail later, but this is what I would call the big 3, because when you think about these, they are the ones that have been keeping people very busy under full IFRS standard. So I'll talk about these big 3 standards in a little bit of more detail on the next couple of slides. Now, if you look at the RFI, the request for information, you're going to see that the board asks 3 types of question. First type of question is, should the board align the IFRS for SMEs? So when considering changes introduced by the revised conceptual framework issued in 2018, the board felt it is important that the IFRS for SMEs and full IFRS have the same anchor point. They have the same framework. Now, IFRS standards what the board thought of aligning include IFRS 3, IFRS 9, IFRS 10, and IFRS 16. The request for information also asks whether the IFRS for SMEs should be aligned with these standards, but it also includes some subtopics. So it looks at simplifications, and then you have some subtopics. We're going to look at this when I'm going to explain IFRS 9 in a little bit more detail. Now, moving on to the second type of question in the RFI, which is, should the board not align the IFRS for SMEs? This includes IFRS 14, regulatory deferral account, and I'm going to touch on that when I cover part C of the RFI. This brings me to the third type of question, which is something in between, where we needed some more information. For example, IFRS 15 about revenue recognition, or where we are thinking about partial alignment. For example, IFRS 11. So on IFRS 11, joint arrangements, we thought that it would be important to align the definition of joint control. That's because the definition of joint control in IFRS 11 is linked to the definition of control in IFRS 10. But essentially, we would retain the accounting for joint arrangement as it is right now in the IFRS for SMEs. Now, there are also a number of areas in the RFI where the board is requesting for further information, and these include cryptocurrency and the application of defined benefit obligation simplification, hedge accounting. I'm going to touch on these as we go along. So that's a high-level overview of part B. You can see within the scope of this review, there are a lot more big standards compared to the first review, because the first review was very limited. So yeah, you could see a lot more changes coming through this review. Now I'm going to touch a little bit in more detail about what I called earlier the big 3 to give you a flavor about what's in the RFI. So the first one is revenue. That's probably the biggest one to my mind that need to be addressed, because if you think about this, if we are trying to align the SME standard to some degree with full IFRS, we need to make sure that revenue is one of those that could be there. When we applied the alignment principles to IFRS 15, the question of relevance was an obvious one. Revenue is a crucial number to users of SMEs' financial statements, and therefore revenue is an area in which most, if not all, SMEs need guidance. So the question we asked ourselves was around simplification and a bit more about timing. So should we do IFRS 15 now? And also the board had some sympathy where you could end up doing an awful lot of work to not get a lot of changes for SMEs, especially for some of the more simplified contracts that SMEs might be undertaking. So for many contracts, such as straightforward retail transactions, IFRS 15 will have little, if any, effect on the amount and timing of revenue recognition. So what the board decided to do was to ask for further information and to say, look, we think there are 3 approaches. First, we could try and align the big principles, and we did get some feedback from some of our constituents that actually some of the principles around IFRS 15 would be quite useful and it would be helpful to bring them along. Second, we could do a full rewrite. So we completely start from scratch. Now, one thought for rewriting this is something that was in the snapshot of IFRS 15, but not in IFRS 15 itself. Many people will be familiar with them, which we call the 5-step for the way you apply IFRS 15. So a thought in this space was to rewrite section 23 as those 5 steps, that is identify the contract, identify performance obligation, determine the transaction price, allocate the transaction price, and recognize revenue. In a way, that would be a substantial rewrite of Section 23, but it may make Section 23 easier to apply. Or the third approach, we leave it alone. We say IFRS 15 is still a new standard. People have just started applying it because it's a big standard. We need to make sure that maybe we need to go through the PIR first, see how practice has developed with IFRS 15. This is one example where deciding what the cutoff date is and how we're going to apply it is very, very important in terms of the approach we take to those standards. So in this case, the board did not decide which approach. Instead, what we said is we have no particular preference. You tell us your preference for this one. It seems to me that the RFI probably does cover most of the alternatives you could have. But certainly, as this is an RFI and we are looking for views, if somebody has a 4th option, it would be worth for us considering it. So it would be good for us to know. On financial instrument, we clearly have got IFRS 9 now. When we considered how the IFRS for SMEs should be aligned with IFRS 9, we looked at each topic individually. When we looked at classification of financial asset, we felt that we could ease application of the IFRS for SME by supplementing the list of examples in Section 11 with a principle based on the financial assets contractual cash flow characteristics, more in line with IFRS 9. And if we align for the classification of financial asset, we would introduce 2 simplification. And let me very briefly highlight the 2 simplification. First, we would remove the requirement to determine how financial assets should be classified and measured on the basis of the entity's business model for managing the financial asset. And second, we will remove that option to present in other comprehensive income subsequent changes in the fair value of equity instrument. Now, in IFRS 9, there are 2 ways to do impairment. One is the more general approach, the general expected credit loss model. And second is the simplified approach, the one that you normally use for trade receivables. What we want to do here is we want to bring in the simplified approach and drop the more complex ECL approach. Now, given the scope of the IFRS for SMEs, that is, it is applicable to entities that do not have public accountability, we thought it would be appropriate to only require the simplified approach. We want to align the definition and requirements for financial guarantee contracts. This is a specific concern in the IFRS for SMEs, where people are actually struggling with applying the guidance on financial guarantee contracts. So here we felt it would be a good idea to align with IFRS 9. Now, when we applied the relevance principle, there were some topics that the board decided that it is unlikely to be relevant to entities applying the IFRS for SMEs. And we decided not to include them in the second comprehensive review. This topic includes financial liabilities and own credit. We also have disclosures required by IFRS 7. That's because it's a previous decision the board made, and we think that this decision still holds true. So we don't think we need to revisit that. And also the requirements for derecognition of financial assets and financial liabilities is already aligned with IAS 39. And there was not much change in IFRS 9 because it was brought unchanged to IFRS 9. And it's already simplified in the IFRS for SMEs. Now on hedging, the interesting bit. On hedging, what we're doing is we are asking if SMEs are actually applying the hedge accounting requirements right now. If yes, we will probably retain the current requirement. If not, we will just completely drop it. But if we find out that there's a need for hedge accounting, we will not align it with IFRS 9. That's because Section 12 hedging requirements is well understood. It's well accepted by users and preparers of financial statement applying the IFRS for SMEs. Now, the other thing to point out is the other thing we're being asked is we are asking question on the fallback. Remember, the IFRS for SMEs right now says that an entity has a free choice of deciding whether to apply IAS 39 instead of section 11 and 12 of the IFRS for SMEs. Last time we asked this question, we found that the fallback is not something that is widely used. And so our starting point this time would be the same. And then we'll find out if people actually are using the fallback. If not, we might just drop the fallback. We might just get rid of it. But if we find out that companies out there are using the fallback, then we will need to update the fallback to apply IFRS 9 instead of IAS 39. So that would be the approach we would follow. So please do let us know if the fallback is important, because I think it's important that we understand if we still need to put this in the standard. So it's quite important for us to understand from you, what do you think about IFRS 9? Is it one of the standards which you think we should align with? Do you like what we've proposed in terms of how we will align? Or do you think we should just leave it alone? So it would be interesting to hear that feedback from you. Moving on to leases.
Sí, exacto, exacto. Pero entonces si no,
One second, yes, sir.
Los micrófonos.
Yes, you can go, yes, sir.
Sorry. Moving on to leases. This is an interesting one. It's a topic that has created a lot of interest, a lot of thought process for SMEs already, and we expect that this is one of the areas where we will receive a lot of feedback. For those of you who work with full IFRS, you would know that the new IFRS 16 on leases introduced the new single model for lessees. The idea being, of course, if you got a lease that meet the definition of a lease, you effectively have to account for that as a finance lease. In the first instance, we considered if leases is relevant to SMEs, and we said absolutely. According to one report, leasing is the third most important source of finance for SMEs, with around 40% of SMEs using leases. So IFRS 16 readily passed the relevance test. So we then moved on. What we did is we looked at how we could simplify the approach for SMEs. We thought that a suggestion might be to require that an SME essentially apply finance lease accounting that currently exists in the IFRS for SMEs. It's already simplified. It's only 2 pages. So requiring a single lessee accounting model could be viewed as a simplification. We would introduce the same recognition exemption for short-term leases and low-value assets that already exists in IFRS 16. So we will see what kind of feedback we get, especially on the low-value assets, what kind of value we should be thinking about. But we would also introduce some additional simplification. One such potential simplification is permitting the option to use a discount rate by reference to market yield on high-quality corporate bonds, when the interest rate implicit in the lease and the lessee's incremental borrowing rate cannot be readily determined. Another potential simplification is a definition of lease term, as set out in IFRS 16. That definition requires judgment, and it relies on part on expectations relating to uncertain future outcomes. The board concluded that less judgment would be required if the IFRS for SMEs referred to the non-cancelable period as set out in the lease agreement. Now remember, the proposal here is to align with the single model. I do think that's quite an important one, because it is important to understand if this would be something that SMEs would be up to. So it will be very important to hear from you. If we do alignment to IFRS 16, how far should we go? And it is important for you to look at the proposed simplifications in the RFI. And when you comment on the simplifications. Give us your views on the simplifications that we have proposed in the RFI. So these are the issues that fall into part B. where we talk about alignment with full IFRS. Part B is heavily reliant on the fact that we believe in Part A that we should do the simplified IFRS standard approach. Now, when you go through the survey that we have put on our website that Michelle talked earlier when she was talking about the timeline, you take a look at the type of things we are asking you, and then please do tell us whether we need to do alignment, whether we don't need to do alignment, where alignment is important. So please make sure you do get into that. Now I'm going to move on to talk about Part C. Part C is the last part of the RFI. It looks at new topics and related matters. So there were some new topics that came up. I mentioned IFRS 14 earlier, and here the board noted that because there is an active project on the go at the moment, the board think that we should actually wait for this project before we consider alignment. That's the reason. So the reason here is we are seeking views on not aligning IFRS 14 because of this active project. Now on cryptocurrency, which what I would call the newer issue, the board has considered this topic in full IFRS and decided not to undertake standard setting for holdings of cryptocurrencies because it was not prevalent among IFRS reporters at the time. However, we felt we needed to test this assumption for entities applying the IFRS for SMEs because staff research indicated that some smaller entities in some jurisdictions have holdings of cryptocurrencies. So this is an area where the board is requesting further information to understand if we need to address this issue. What the board is actually asking is, do entities that apply the IFRS for SMEs need guidance for cryptocurrencies and issues of crypto assets? It's important you comment on those because maybe at the moment they are not necessarily big, but you could see them becoming big in the future. So remember that this project alone will take a couple of years to get out and get completed. And the next review could be in 5 years' time, which means if you think about this going to be a big issue, then this is something that we would be interested to hear about in your comment. And then in the RFI, we asked for a little bit of information about the application of defined benefit obligation simplification in Section 28 of the IFRS for SMEs. So Section 28 includes some simplification about the measurement of defined benefit obligation, where you can use a simplification, and there is also relief for the undue cost or effort exemption. However, the board has received feedback that the simplification is not clear and some have found it difficult to apply. But information from the SMEs also suggests that very few entities use the simplification. So the board used the RFI as an opportunity to request further information on whether the simplification are applied regularly, and if so, what difficulties arise in applying the simplification. So if you are facing any difficulties with the simplification, do let us know. The information will help the board decide whether to retain the simplification or maybe perhaps remove them. And then finally, we are asking two broad questions on what you are experiencing and what the board needs to think about. Given that we only get to hear the SME voice once every 5, 6 years, your input on what's working and what's not working in the SME space is very important for us. So first, we are asking if there's anything else that we have not covered, which you think we should cover. So we are asking you for your advice on whether we should pick up on anything else that are important for the SMEs. Second, we are asking if there's anything else at all that you would like to bring to the attention of the board. So anything out there that the board haven't thought about in terms of not just changes to the IFRS for SMEs, but perhaps in a broader context in the way we operate in this space. So please do let us know. It's important we understand this as it's quite a comprehensive review. So for example, we had some feedback about borrowing costs because, as you may know, under full IFRS, it requires capitalization of borrowing costs, whereas for cost-benefit reasons, the IFRS for SMEs requires such costs to be charged as expenses. This is an area where you can respond to the board if you have any issues. So that's a high-level overview of the part A, B, and C of the RFI. I'm going to see if Michelle can still join us. Otherwise, I will move on.
I am here, Yusuf. Can you hear me?
Yes. Okay.
Right.
So,
do you want to continue sharing the slides and then we'll just move on? So I'm going to give an overview now before we open for question and answers on how you can respond to the request for information and the next steps that we are planning for the project. So as I said, in terms of responding to the request for information, the board is aware that we don't have the same relationships with entities that apply the SME standards as we have with those that use full IFRS standards. And so we developed different ways to help people respond to the request for information. And this slide is a flowchart that we put together to help people determine the best way for them to respond. So we say, do you have an existing process for submitting a comment letter? And if you do, we recommend you submit a comment letter. And that's because a comment letter we see as something that is very considered and sets out the views, and therefore we hold it, the content, as having greater influence. But if you don't have sufficient capacity or the resources to submit a comment letter, but you do have the resources to submit a comment letter, then what we suggest is that you use our optional response document, which, as I said, is a Word document and sets out all the questions, so you just have to fill in the answers. But if you don't have the process or the resource, then we do suggest people complete the online survey, which includes the exactly same questions as are in the RFI, but they have shorter responses. And then, as we have said, the deadline for the comment letters is coming up quite soon and will be at the end of this month. So if we move on, what we'll be doing once the comment letters come in. So what we think the best thing to do is to take to the board summaries of the different forms of feedback we've got to the request for information. So we'll take a paper that summarises the feedback we hear from the optional response documents and from the comment letters. We'll look separately at the online survey results. As I said, we have made available a user survey, and that is very short and only focuses on users, so we will include that as a separate feedback to the board. And then finally, we will feedback from what we've heard in our outreach activities, and that's why meetings like today are so important to us, because we will bring that back to the board. So that will take us to the beginning of November. So we think in November we'll be sat at our desks, but I think most of us are in London and we'll be sat at our desks at home, actually, analysing the feedback we've got and probably talking over Teams, trying to work out the next steps. We plan to bring a paper to the board in December. Now, actually, it won't be a paper. We're planning on bringing a PowerPoint presentation, which will set out the key messages that we've heard in all of the outreach. And what we plan to ask the board is, what are the questions that they want to ask the SMEs members? So what is it that they want to hear from the SMEs members following the key messages? And we think, therefore, in December and January, we will be back at our desks writing papers for the SMEs members. And we have a meeting planned for the SMEs members at the end of January, beginning of February. And we're planning for that to be a virtual meeting, because we think at the moment where the UK is, it's best probably just to make this a virtual meeting. And also, the SMEs members don't always have the resources, so we think it's better to hold that meeting in February as a virtual meeting. And then what we will do is take a plan for phase 2, and our aim is to take that to the board in March 2021. And at that point, we'll be able to know whether the board we're planning for an exposure draft, or what we are planning to do with the IFRS for SME standard. So if we move on to the final slide, this slide sets out what we have heard in terms of feedback in our work so far. So I think when I was unfortunately disconnected, Yusuf provided an overview of the alignment principles. And one question we had was, oh, historically you talked about the IFRS for SMEs being based on IFRS standards and it being based on costs and benefits. How do these alignment principles fit into cost and benefits? And we've tried to address that in today's presentation, but also Daryl Scott wrote an article before his term of office ended at the board, and that article is on our website, and he provides some personal views about what he thinks about alignment. I think he took the article as his opportunity to say farewell to the SME standard, but he does address that point about costs and benefits. And then we had some feedback that, is it really going to be possible to align the standards, especially the new, more complex standards, and keep the IFRS for SMEs simple? And I think Yusuf explained our initial thinking that we've tried to set out and to seek views on in the RFI. I think that will be a challenge, but by breaking the topics down, we've tried to come up with ways forward. And anything we do, if we do decide to amend the IFRS for SMEs, that would be subject to an exposure draft and due process. So that will be our challenge as staff members. And I think that challenge is balanced because some of the feedback to Part B says comparability is important. And we hear comparability is important for two reasons. One is for entities that are SMEs and are applying the standard, they want to be comparable to their peers. But we also hear that comparability is important for the financial reporting institution as a whole. So from the educational purposes and through up, having that consistent framework does have a cost benefit. And then in relation to IFRS 9, we've had some feedback that even the simplified expected credit loss model is quite complex. So we've had some feedback about general corporates struggling to apply the expected credit loss model, even though it's the simplified version. And then we've had feedback that the measurement of intercompany loans and intercompany balances is quite complex, and we should think about simplifications in that area. On IFRS 16, this is more about when we should align, I think. And I don't think it's difficult to say a view that we are seeing coming through is we shouldn't align on the date the standard becomes effective, but we possibly shouldn't wait until the post-implementation review is completed. And there seems to be people saying, well, after 2 years of a major standard being effective, which kind of gives you a stable platform for that platform, and any implementation issues have been resolved, that's the time for the IFRS for SME standard to think about aligning. And I think that's why we're hearing about implementation experience on IFRS 16, because we are in that 2-year implementation phase. And one of the areas we've had a question is, well, if you do align, what transitional reliefs might you provide? And we, in the RFI on IFRS 15, for example, we do set out some possible transition reliefs, but we would look at those should the board decide to look at any exposure draft. And then finally, in Part C, and as Yusuf said, this is the area where the board is saying, are there any other points you wish us to consider? Now, the board made the decision not to consult on the scope of the standard, and the appendix, I think it's Appendix A of the standard, does explain the work the board did, the outreach it undertook on possibly amending the scope of the standard, and therefore why it decided not to consult. And the reason it decided not to consult, I think, was it felt it had consulted extensively when the standard was developed. It had consulted as part of the first comprehensive review. And then in the second comprehensive review, we had undertaken some outreach activities, and we hadn't found and identified any new ways to address some of the concerns people have around scope. So the board felt it wouldn't be appropriate, without having new ideas that we could put forward, to consult again on the scope. I guess one of the things I have heard is that the name of the standard should perhaps be updated, and perhaps now is the time to think about changing the name rather than it being IFRS for SMEs. The SMEs bit seems to cause a little bit of offence. So those are the big picture issues that we've been hearing in our outreach so far. I mean, thank you, Sif, for standing in for me when my connection problems occurred. And it just shows what a great teammate I have, actually. So well done. And with that, I think we can open to questions.
Jorge, si quieres abrir para preguntas, si quieres hacer en inglés, puede ser directo para el team de proyecto, o si quieres hacer en español, yo puedo intentar traducir para inglés si necesario.
Muchas gracias, Tadeu. Thank you very much, Michelle and Joseph, for your presentations. It was an excellent presentation for us. Hay 2, 3 o 4 preguntas en el chat. Tadeu, si quieres mirarlas, están en inglés. Y a todos los invitamos a realizar las preguntas en el chat. Y también habíamos pedido una idea de qué país estaban representando, si pueden escribirlo también en el chat para poder hacer una noticia estadística. Entonces, Tadeu, te dejo, si quieres, la pregunta de José Hernández y de Guillermo, que han hecho 2 preguntas entre los dos.
Gracias. I think that Michelle and Joseph, you can see that one. The first one is, and it is quite common when, especially before we have the IFRS in many countries in South America, that there were one single standard just to deal with fair value. And that's why maybe the question is, was the creation of a specific section for fair value evaluated by the team?
So yes, when we looked at aligning with IFRS 13, we did think, well, would it be better to have a specific section? And we could have a specific section, but it would be a bit of an odd number. So we thought maybe it would be better if we put it in section 2. I think what's interesting is if you look at the feedback to the first comprehensive review, the board do say aligning with IFRS 13 is unlikely to change practice in the IFRS for SME statement standard. But I do think it's a little bit messy at the moment, the standard, the way IFRS 13 is sort of spread all over the standard. So I think it would be better to bring the guidance all together in one place, whether that's an appendix to section 2 or whether it's an additional section. I don't think really makes much difference. I think what will be important is tidying it up and bringing it all together.
No te escuchamos, Tadeu.
Sorry about that. One question here, and then I can understand the question, is that does the simplification proposed for section 20 include the recognition of assets and liability as proposed by IFRS 16? Because the question here is that when we talk about simplification, are we considering adopting the one single definition for lease? That means there is no operational lease and finance lease for lessees. Is it the simplification we are talking about, and therefore we are moving towards what we have today in IFRS 16?
Yes, the answer to that question is yes. We would be talking about aligning with IFRS 16 and having one model, so that we would remove the distinction for lessees for the operating models. However, we would keep things like the low value exemption. or what we're consulting on is keeping those things like the low value exemption. So I have to say that I think the number of leases that SMEs will have will probably be around their property, because if you keep the 1 year exemption and you keep the low value exemption, then you're probably talking about property leases or very significant pieces of plant. Yusuf, do you want to add anything to that?
We can hear you, Yusuf.
Hello?
Yes.
Yes. So on IFRS 16, we would basically bring in that single model. So we will eliminate that operating lease, but the simplification are mostly around those complex areas of IFRS 16, like discount rate, variable lease payment, and lease term.
Excellent. I mean, that again, despite moving towards IFRS 16, is not just bringing the entire text of IFRS 16, but bringing IFRS 16, applying the alignment principle of simplification in faithful representation.
Yes.
Okay, good. The other question is in relation to, actually, it's a kind of comment as well. In respect of cryptocurrencies or crypto assets, don't they fit the financial instrument standard? Isn't simpler in view that relatively few enterprises use them to not have a separated standard? I mean, but in the end of the day, that's exactly what we are asking. Is whether cryptocurrencies is something that is common for SMEs and whether we should do something in relation to this one. I think that would be also good in this point here to remind those attending this outreach that we have an interpretation, a gender decision actually on cryptocurrencies. And I think that it helps very much to clarify.
Yeah, I think when we took the subject of cryptocurrencies to the board were reluctant to put something in a standard that wasn't in an IFRS standard already. So they wanted to be sure that if they were going to address a problem, they were quite sure that problem existed. So as Yusuf said, there were three types of questions. Should we align, or do you agree we shouldn't align, or we need more information? And the cryptocurrency question definitely falls into the we need more information. And I think if you read the papers around the Interpretations Committee's agenda decision, they felt that there were not significant holdings of cryptocurrencies in entities that apply full IFRS standards. And so we really needed to have some evidence about whether entities applying the IFRS for SMEs were holding cryptocurrencies or using cryptocurrencies.
Yes, that's correct. Which is why what we did in the RFI is we are only consulting on whether it is prevalent. We did not look at a solution. We say we're going to look at whether it's prevalent first before we look at what kind of accounting section that would be.
Thank you very much, Michelle and Yusuf. There is one more question here from Jorge. Can you explain the principal relevance to SMEs?
So I'm going to take ownership of the principles. So they were my idea to have the principles, and the reason that I came up with the idea of having the principles was because it was to try and help the board to have a structure in its thought process when it was thinking about how to develop the IFRS for SME standard, because historically the board had said, well, the IFRS for SME standards is based on IFRS, and we make the decisions based on costs and benefits, so the benefits to users and the cost to preparers pretty much. But we didn't really have a thinking process beyond that. So the principles are about identifying the thinking. And I think the first question the board has to ask itself is this topic relevant to SMEs? And so when we looked at IFRS 3, for instance, we broke IFRS 3 down into the significant amendments that have been made to the standard since the IFRS for SMEs had been developed. And then by looking at each of those amendments, we could say, well, is this relevant to SMEs? And so one of those areas is step acquisitions. So the board said, well, we don't really know whether the SMEs needs requirements on step acquisitions, because actually we don't know if SMEs undertake that many step acquisitions. So the RFI says, does the standard need information about does the standard need requirements for step acquisitions? So that's a question of, is it relevant? And I think the hedge accounting is another one of those examples about whether it's relevant, because I think the board felt, does the IFRS for SME standard really need requirements for hedge accounting? And the board had divided views on this subject. So we just asked the question, is it relevant? So it's about trying to identify whether SMEs undertake transactions that need these requirements.
Okay, Michelle, could we also refer to, please correct me if I'm wrong, Michelle. For example, segment information is not something that is relevant for SMEs, and that's why we don't have this. And we also had some discussions on, for example, insurance. It's a big discussion, because we think that if insurance is, it's supposed that insurers they are out of, they would have some public accountability, but we might have some insurance contracts also in other companies that don't have insurance as their main activities, and then it would be relevant. I mean, that it's not an easy principle to apply, and that's why I think it's important having it.
Yeah, to be fair, after we came up with the principles and then we structured all of the board papers asking, is this relevant? What simplifications? And then is the outcome a faithful portrayal? It did enable. It was quite tricky. It proved that we need the principles. I think with IFRS 17, well, I'm quite glad that I'll probably be retired by the next time the IFRS for SMEs review comes up, because for this review, the IFRS 17 is out of scope, but it would be in scope, I guess, in 5 or 6 years' time. So I'll just have to retire early, I think.
Let me see if I have more. Okay, there is one question here on Oscar. Oscar, what will be the differences with the simplified expected credit loss with IFRS 9?
Yusuf, do you want to?
So yes, so when we did look at this, we were also trying to see if we could simplify the simplified approach. We did the same approach with IFRS 16, for example, the low value exemption, but the board did not agree with that, so we kept the same exemption for 16, for example, as IFRS 16. For the simplified approach, the simple answer is we will not look at further modification of the simplified approach. So we will just bring in the simplified approach as it is in IFRS 9 into the IFRS for SMEs.
Thank you, Yusuf. There is one question here that I think that you touched that one, Michelle, but I think it would be good to clarify. Will the scope of IFRS for SMEs be reconsidered? I mean, the current scope of IFRS for SMEs, if I can just say this in a very simplified way, for those companies that doesn't have some public accountability. But are we asking whether we should review it or not, or directly or indirectly, let's say?
So I think the board made the decision that they didn't want to seek views, but if the feedback provides quite clear views, then we would need to take that feedback. Our due process would require us to take that feedback to the board. So let me just give you an update on a bit of background to the work we did. So at the beginning of 2019, we included scope, and we spoke to our advisory council, and we also spoke to the International Forum of Standard Setters. And we had this idea that maybe rather than try and change the definition of public accountability, which we had consulted on previously, what we could do is we could say certain entities are exempt. And so the idea, if I remember rightly, was that we said maybe on listed entities, if you are a closely held listed entity, so maybe there's only 5 or 6 shareholders, then you could agree as a group of shareholders that the IFRS was for SMEs was okay, and you could apply the IFRS for SMEs. And maybe on fiduciary capacity, if you had a credit union and that credit union was a closed credit union and it was quite small, maybe you could be exempt. Although you would be public accountability, you would still be permitted to apply the standard. But when we spoke to both the advisory groups and the national standard setters, the feedback we got was putting boundaries around those exempt groups would be really difficult, and they didn't support this idea. So we had reconsidered the definition in phase 1, and we had not really made any progress. We've done some outreach about possibly offering exemptions if you are a public accountable entity, and that hasn't gone anywhere. So I think if you are thinking about raising the question on the definition and the scope of the standard, then I would think quite hard about recommending to the board what the board could do. And certainly from my own experience, if I draw back on my own experience of implementing the standard in the UK and the Republic of Ireland, when we opened up the scope in the UK, the thing we were able to do was to say, it's these entities that are captured by this company law or this Bank of England law that can apply the standard. But the thing was, we couldn't really do that without changing the disclosure requirements. So the moment you open the scope of the standard, you end up having to look at the requirements of the standard. So if you look in the UK, we have a lot more disclosures that are required. So we say these entities, so I think we say private banks in the UK, there are a number of private banks, can apply the IFRS for SME standard. But if you're a private bank, you have to provide these extra disclosures. So there is a challenge between opening the standard and then making it more complex. And I think the board, they are difficult challenges that the board would need to consider.
Thank you, Michelle. If there is any other, I didn't see any other question here in the chat. If anyone wants to raise any question, please feel free writing or just open your microphone, please.
Si quieren abrir el micrófono y pedir la palabra, lo pueden hacer sin inconvenientes. O escribirlo en el chat para terminar de aprovechar las respuestas, por favor.
¿Puedo hacer una pregunta en vivo, Jorge?
Sí, adelante, sí.
Oh, hello, Michelle. Thank you.
Hello.
Thank you very much. This is Felipe Pérez Cervantes from Mexico. Thank you for your presentation. Very clear, very interesting. I have one concern, one question. I fully agree with the simplification objective. However, I believe it should be applied also to the full IFRS. Otherwise, what we do is to create differences that are difficult to understand for investors. For instance, one investor who applies full IFRS and they use the impairment model, and the same investor has an investment in an important company who applies IFRS for SMEs, and they have to amortize. Therefore, these two companies have different equity because of this treatment. And there are many other examples. Even in some places, they have said, well, that is not acceptable, and even can create legal problems between investors. What is the response for that kind of concerns?
So I think there are differences between full IFRS and the IFRS for SMEs at the moment, and it is, and we have heard comparability is important as part of the feedback, but we've also heard that cost benefit is important, and I think if we start with the strategic question, should the standard be aligned, then it seems to me what you're suggesting is the standard should be aligned, and that as we align and we simplify the standard, we do need to make sure we don't lose the faithful representation of the standard. I don't think the board will. I think the board are open to looking for simplifications, and that's why the relevance question is important as well, because once we decide something's relevant, we don't want to just import full IFRS standards. We need to then think carefully about how can we make this more simplified and easier for SMEs to apply.
I understand. Okay.
And I think the post-implementation review process is the process where you can engage on full IFRS standards and complexities. So the board will issue a request for information later this year on the post-implementation review of IFRS 10, 11 and 12. And that's one area where we've been hearing that there are some complexities around applying that standard. So we'll be able to build on the feedback from that standard as well.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.
And if I can also remind all here that we have currently a project on subsidiaries that are SMEs. What would be that? Is for example, a subsidiary or an investee, because they have to report, despite they meet the definition of SME, because they need to report to their investors or parent company in IFRS full, they have their IFRS for SME financial statements, but then they need to make some adjustments for reporting this to these investors. What this project is discussing is a proposal, is whether these investments, they could apply IFRS full for reporting purposes and also for preparing their financial statement, but for the presentation and disclosure, they would have a more simplified approach, not exactly the same that we have in IFRS for SME, but it would be a much more simplified financial statements in terms of probably presentation and definitely disclosures. This is something that it's not an easy project. We have been facing a lot of discussions in relation to this one, but I know that there are, especially multinational companies with several subsidiaries in different countries, that sometimes they have to even have a high cost of preparing a very long financial statements, despite they are SME, because in the end of the day they decide applying IFRS full, because otherwise the burden of preparing a reconciliation between their numbers, the figures that they use for local financial statements, and the one that they have to report is so big, they just move towards IFRS full. With this project, it would be something that would not have a recognition measurement differences. It would be just simplification in terms of presentation and disclosure, something that is also on the table, and we have been discussing this project as well. That is one question question as well here is that with what standards to align? And in Latin America, we think that we should look for the one that generates the least differences with IFRS. We are thinking that time is a big difference too. What do you think about this? I think this is related to the last question in terms of whether we are using a standard after, for example, post-implementation review. Sorry, I think that I was I think that it was in mute or not. Anyway, we have one. I think so. Sorry if I'm repeating. I thought that I was in mute. Definitely. We have a question here that with what standards to align? In Latin America, we think that we should look for the one that generates the least differences with IFRS. We are thinking that time is a big difference too. What do you think about this? I think that this is related to the question on whether we use the standard only after the version of the standard IFRS, only after the, for example, post-implementation review or right after the issue. I think that it's related to this one. I don't know, Michelle or Joseph would like to comment on this.
So yes, in the RFI, we do ask a question about when to consider alignment. And there we give a couple of options. So one of them is issued up to the publication date of the RFI. The second one is effective before publication date of the RFI. And the third one is effective and on which the post-implementation review was completed before publication date of the RFI. And we are also asking for some feedback here. So if people have some other dates, they can suggest it in their comment. So one of the things, for example, we've been hearing is people were saying that we should, after a standard is issued, we should perhaps wait for like 2 years of implementation experience to develop before we start considering for alignment.
And one point here is, for example, in terms of timing, that will also always have a difference, because actually that's the way it operates, the process of alignment with IFRS. It always occurs later on, and then the timing difference will always exist.
Yes.
I'm not seeing any other questions here in the chat. I don't know whether anyone, si quieres hacer una pregunta directamente, solo abrir el micrófono. Tiene una pregunta acá in the chat. From your perspective, which are the main challenges for implementing of IFRS SMEs in Latin America?
Es más una pregunta para Tadeo.
I think that one common situation we have in Latin America is that some of the accounting requirements are strongly linked with the legislation, not only the corporate legislation, but the tax legislation as well. And then every time that we have any change, and this is not only for SMEs, but for IFRS full, every time that we have to implement a new standard or a change to a current standard, and it may lead to an increasing basis for taxation, or if we bring some, let's say, difference or divergence to what is required by the local legislation, I think that this is one of the main difficulties we have in Latin America. Otherwise, it's exactly the same as any other of the 140 countries that is applying as required IFRS, and others that are also allowed. But I think that Latin America specifically, we still have many things in our incorporated into our legislation, and definitely it makes the process more difficult sometimes.
Bueno, Tadeo, muchas gracias. Vamos a ver si hay una pregunta más de los asistentes que quieran hacerlo en forma verbal. Domingo, los miembros del directorio de GLENIF, José Luis, si quieren hacer una pregunta, por favor.
Yo tengo una pregunta, José Luis.
Adelante.
¿Yo puedo hacer en español, Tadeo? No estoy a te oír.
No te escuchamos, Tadeo, estás muteado.
Disculpa, sí. Sí, claro, José, puede ser en español y yo voy a traducir para los miembros del staff.
Un punto importante es que el alineamiento, desde que sea en los principios, en los conceptos, yo creo que es muy factible. La gran cuestión es cuando el alineamiento puede estar en los detalles, ¿no? Puede ser una cosa quizá muy costosa para una pequeña empresa o para lo estándar, tener el concepto de alineamiento por completo. Esto creo que es muy difícil hacerlo. Entonces, gustaría de oír un poco del equipo sobre esto. Y el segundo punto es, una vez que tengamos la nueva norma para SMEs, ¿cómo será el manejo de actualización? Porque el full IFRS tiene una actualización muy constante, permanente. Y esto para las pequeñas entidades también es bastante costoso. Y esta discusión yo creo que fue muy fuerte en la primera versión de la IFRS para pequeñas empresas. Ahora yo creo que la cuestión se permanece porque es una consideración económica que se involucra cuando vamos a hacer una normatización contable para pequeñas empresas. Entonces, Tadeo, gustaría de oírte a respecto de esto, el equipo, cómo ven estos dos puntos, ¿no? No sé si me hizo claro. Si mi español está bien para usted. Gracias. No te escucho.
Estaba hablando que su español es perfecto, especialmente para nosotros.
Ok, gracias.
What actually Jose was discussing is that first, difficulty in the alignment, because at the end of the day, the devil is in the details. When we start making the alignment, you may, if you are not very thoughtful in relation to the simplification, you might bring a very difficult process into the IFRS for SME applying. It is, again, I mean that, okay, we should have an alignment, but sometimes this alignment is something that is very difficult for an SME to apply. That's the question that Jose has posed. Is, I mean that alignment is welcome, but sometimes the alignment will bring a big burden to the SMEs that there is no simplification principle that can overtake this one. And the second question is in relation to the update of the IFRS for SMEs. As everybody knows that every year we have changes in IFRS. Sometimes they are very related to narrow scope amendment, but sometimes, as Yusuf said, you have the big standards. And then the question is whether we should also rediscuss how often should this IFRS for SME comprehensive review be carried out.
So on this question, can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can. We can.
Yes. So on this question, I think the board in the past made the decision that it's going to be a periodical review rather than an annual review, because for SMEs, that stable platform is very important. So that's why we have this 2 years after effective. So the first comprehensive review was effective in 2017. So the second comprehensive review started 2 years after that. Because I think most of the feedback that we get from constituents is 3 to 4 years is the average that an SME would be able to handle change, because a lot of people spoke about the cost of implementing change for SMEs. So something that is done regularly will be a burden for SMEs.
It's interesting that we have one comment here that is from Jorge. The intention of the IASB in relation to including important IFRS topics in the IFRS for SMEs without waiting for the general review of the IFRS for SMEs. That's a very good point. I mean, that sometimes you may have a very good, important change in IFRS full that people may say that, why don't we incorporate this immediately to IFRS for SME? Why do we need to wait until for the next comprehensive review? Could you comment on this, Joseph?
Yes. So the things is, first of all, we also had this question sometimes where people were saying if we were considering the proposal on the primary financial statements. But then we said that the board set the objective of only looking at an IFRS after it's been issued. The other thing is on the comprehensive review of the IFRS for SMEs, the board decided that it will be a periodic review. So in terms of without waiting for the general revision of the IFRS for SMEs, I think that if this is the case, then it will become a regular update.
Well, I think there is another point, Youssef.
Yes.
And that is, if there is a significant issue, the SME implementation group have the right to recommend that the board make an amendment to the standard in the interim. So in fact, we did reach out to our SME implementation group regarding the IBOR amendments that the board has issued and whether they felt that the IBOR amendments were so were relevant to SMEs such that we should make an interim amendment. And the feedback we got back was that no, they didn't feel that we needed to amend the IFRS for SME standard for the IBOR amendments. So we do have a process if there is an urgent issue that would require the standard to be amended. We've never needed to use that process, but there is a process available.
Yeah, good point. I mean, that if that is something important that we don't need to wait for, but we have the big members to help to assess this one. Very good point. One question here from Oscar. Related to the implementation in Latin America, do you consider appropriate to exist an entity, public or private, to supervise correct implementation of IFRS, or maybe IFRS and IFRS for SME, or maybe to issue penalties or sanctions to ensure the compliance? Well, I after my 30 years working as an auditor, I can answer this, and now being at the board, I can answer this question. Is the point is that the auditors are still the most important gatekeeper for the implementation of IFRS around the world. Because in the end of the day, for example, if you think about SEC can bring some penalties or ask you to do something different from what you have done if you are listed in the US. And then the only transnational body, let's say, or entity that could do something to get some consistent application of IFRS, in the end of the day, are the audit companies, especially when they are related to an international network. I mean that even the smaller audit firms, they are linked to these IFRS networks, and this is the way that actually we have to keep the application of IFRS in a consistent way. But from our point of view as a board, I mean, definitely what we do is to issue the standards and to bring some consistency. What we can do, we have this outreach as we are doing here. We have our educational materials. We have IFRS conference. We have our network all the time talking to the stakeholders through our very many consultative bodies that we have. ASAF is one of them, and then we have a representative of the GLES, for example, there. We also have the IFRS Interpretation Committee, that when you have a diversity in practice in a region in relation to the interpretation, for example, of a standard, we can bring these questions into the IFRS Interpretation Committee. I mean that it's not a single solution for the consistency. I think that is a combination of all this that helps us to have some consistency in terms of the application of IFRS. I hope that answered the question. Si quieres tener una... Oh, sí, claro, por favor, Marta.
Michelle. I have two doubts. First, it's a conceptual doubt regarding the framework, because we have some discussions in Brazil, and that seems to me some persons think that framework is the same for IFRS, for SME, and IFRS full. And for me, I think it's not true. Then I have this doubt, and I'd like to listen for you. If it's true or not true. It's a first doubt. And the second doubt regarding the amendments in IFRS that Jose de Brazil talking about it, because when IFRS 16 were issued, people in Brazil think that it's possible to use IFRS 16 if you apply IFRS for SME. And it's strong to me. It's strange. And what do you think about it? Is it possible to apply some IFRS full if I apply IFRS for SME? Two dots.
So I'll take each thought at a time, if that's okay. So the conceptual framework. So the board issued a new conceptual or a revised conceptual framework in 2016, I think. And so that updated the board's conceptual framework, and the IFRS for SME standard has not been updated for that conceptual framework. So there are differences between the IFRS conceptual framework and the section 2 of the IFRS for SME standard. But there's also another difference, which is, I think, an important difference as well, is the conceptual framework for the IFRS for SME standard is part of the standards, whereas the conceptual framework in IFRS standards is not part of the standards. So it's the framework that the board uses for setting standards. So one of the questions we have had in our outreach is about the status of the conceptual framework and whether we should change it. But we've had some discussions with the team that wrote the conceptual framework, and they feel quite strongly that for SMEs, having the conceptual framework as part of the standard is important, because there's actually less specific requirements in the IFRS for SMEs. So when an entity doesn't have the requirements, it needs the framework, and therefore the framework should be part of the standard. So that was the point on the conceptual framework. And then on amendments to IFRS standards, the IFRS for SMEs is a standalone document, and that has always been the board's position. So you apply the IFRS for SMEs. If the board brings in a new requirement to full IFRS standards, it does not flow into the IFRS for SMEs. Now, I think that is the truth. I think there might be instances where the board makes a minor amendment to full IFRS standards and it clarifies something in IFRS standards, which, because you could say, well, that clarification can be applied. So I think there's a difference between you can apply a clarification to it is required to apply it. I don't think you would ever be required to apply it.
I think that, Michelle, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that provided that this amendment to the IFRS is not inconsistent with IFRS for SME, because sometimes IFRS for SME, you have, because of the lack of guidance, you may end up being able to apply a change in a standard that it's not clear in IFRS for SME. Therefore, it's just as Michelle said, an interpretation, and it's acceptable. But I'm not saying that it could be a generally apply it, but we might have this type of situation.
Yeah, I think we could have that type of situation.
One comment here is that saying that the Appendix B of it's a comment actually. Appendix B of the IFRS, the RFI, request for information, plays a key role to understand board approach in more detail, as well as the difference between IFRS for SME and IFRS standards. It helps a lot to address all the questions. I fully agree, because this is the heart of the document that goes into the details when you are discussing about the difference between the two standards, definitely.
It was a design issue, really, because we wanted to make the RFI accessible and easy for people to respond to. So we kept the questions, we tried to keep the questions quite short. Unfortunately, they're not all short. And then we put the thinking and the analysis in the appendix. So I'm glad that people find the appendix useful, because it took a lot of writing. But so it's good to have that feedback that people found it helpful.
There's one more question here. It's a very good one, by the way. Supposing that the IFRS IC issues a agenda decision, how the agenda decision interacts with IFRS for SMEs?
Well, I think strictly speaking, it doesn't interact with IFRS for SMEs, because we argue the IFRS for SMEs is a standalone document. That's our position. I guess if you were a preparer and that agenda decision was providing information, you could refer to that. So I think you would have to look at the section on accounting policies. I think it's section 10. Of the IFRS, you would effectively have to look at the hierarchy, which I think, and then see how you would apply it through the hierarchy.
It's important to remind as well, Michelle, that the agenda decision discusses what is in the text of the IFRS standard, not IFRS for SME. It might be a situation that when you have exactly the same text, and then it would be difficult for someone looking at the agenda decision and think that should I apply or not. To be honest, I think that agenda decision is an interpretation of the IFRS standard. not IFRS for SMEs. And that
yeah, but I think you also have to look at paragraph 10.6, which says, in making judgments described in paragraph 10.4, so in selecting your application policies, management may also consider requirements and guidance in full IFRS standards dealing with similar and related issues. So I think it's something you would take into consideration. So I think it's a bit like the cryptocurrency one, as Tadeo said. There's an agenda decision on cryptocurrencies. You would work through the selection and application of accounting policies in paragraphs 10.2 to 10.6 of the SME standard and make your decision about where that agenda decision fits in.
Thank you, Michelle. Very good question, this one.
Bueno, muy bien. Creo que no hay más preguntas en el chat. Antes de agradecer a todos los expositores, queríamos pedirle a los que están conectados si pueden habilitar el video para poder sacar una foto, si es posible. Mientras todos se van habilitando, agradecerles que estuvimos conectados alrededor de 42, 43 personas en la máxima conexión, representando a casi todos los países de América Latina, lo cual es para nosotros muy importante. El grado y la importancia de las preguntas realizadas ha sido muy bueno, de alto nivel. Les agradecemos a quienes hicieron las preguntas y desde luego para todos los expositores, excellent presentations. Many thanks to Michelle, Joseph, and Tadeu for this meeting. It will be very useful to clarify some aspects that we still have pending the document. Thank you very much for all. Y bueno, muchas gracias a todos los que se han conectado. Estén atentos a nuestras futuras invitaciones, dado que hay todo un programa para exponer y estar totalmente cerca de toda América Latina desde GLAS o GLENIF. Y bueno, hacer el cierre, igual que Michelle o Joseph, cualquier conclusión que quieran dar, tienen la palabra, por favor.
Once more, just say thank you very much for the opportunity. The outreach, it's a very important procedure in our due process within the foundation. And IFRS for SME is I think that Latin America and South America is one of the most important regions in terms of the application of IFRS for SME, and that's quite important to listen to your feedback. That's the comment that I would like to say, that really important for us, getting the comments through the comment letter, through the answering the survey or any format. It will be very welcome. And the last comment is just that I saw a comment in the chat that people want Michelle to help with the IFRS 17 alignment with IFRS. They said that you are too young to retire.
No, I think I'll be retired by the time we get to that one.
Okay. Thank you very much for all.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much for us.
Muchas gracias a todos.
Well done.
Bye. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias. Obrigado.
Bye.
Gracias.